Okay, now the mechanics of how we do it. And I gotta say before I start that just because we do it a certain way doesn't mean it's the best way for you. So we're gonna talk about how we do it. I just want to be clear that this doesn't mean you have to do it this way or that it's the best way, period. We use 1 and 2 gallon buckets. We drill holes in the tops of our buckets and put a plug in there. We never ever take the lid off of our bucket, because once you do take that tear tab off, the gasket is already beginning to fatigue, and after several uses you'll start to see seepage around the lid. When you turn the bucket upside down, you'll see sugar syrup leaking around the gasket. So this plug that we're using is called a 2-inch tint plug. You can buy them at our shop. You can find them online, but it's a little tough to get them. If you're a painter or somebody that's used to using chemicals, you'll often see these in the top of a 5-gallon steel can. It's just that plug you pull out before you pour. That's a 2-inch tint. I don't know where they came up with the tint part of the tint plug. Maybe 100 years ago it meant something. I don't know.
I think that's because how they put the colors into the paint when they mix it.
Yeah. Well, maybe
so.
so.
What they do is they pull that plug out and your color goes in there.
Makes sense to me. I'll buy that. And we sell them fairly inexpensive. You can get them from us either with the holes drilled in them already or with no holes at all, and you can do your own thing.
How many holes do you use for different times?
There you go. Well, if we want to get our sugar syrup going in at a fairly good pace, now 10 holes isn't going to dump it overnight. That's still going to take a while. And we're using 1/16 of an inch drill bit. Anytime you're drilling into plastic, that's a good number. You can use larger drill bits, but if you go very much larger than 1/16, it tends to drip too much. But at 1/16, it kind of hangs in the bucket until the bees suck it out. And the reason you have to use a drill bit is that if you use a punch or a nail on like metal, the plastic will swell back into the hole. So you need to remove the plastic with a drill bit in the hole. Now right now, I've told the guys that we're shooting for 4, 5, maybe 6 holes in our plugs. It's early. We're metering it out. You know, I don't need to put 5 gallons on in the next 3 weeks or 4 weeks. So we're feeding slowly but steadily, and maybe even 4 holes right now would be good. You can actually draw a foundation with 4 holes on a nuke. So it tells you that it's enough to get something happening. You can buy these stainless steel screen plugs from Better Bee in New York if you want to go that route. I used to use stainless steel embedded in my bucket lids, but what I found was I had to take the lid off to refill the bucket. And I like the stainless steel in that a good strong colony could take the bucket down in 4 or 5 days, so if you had to get weight on fast, that worked really well. Now these days, if we're on time, I like to take longer. These plugs that I've just been showing you, if you leave them in a bucket of water for a long time, they clean up pretty easily. You can just blow them with air or a water nozzle, and it just blows the wax and propolis out of the hole. And if you leave an empty bucket on top of a colony very long, the bees will plug those holes with something. It looks like wax to me. Now we're using a circle cutter. This is an adjustable circle cutter if you want to make your own buckets and do your own thing. And it works, it's easy, it's not hard. If you got a drill press, you can do it yourself. What do we sell those tint plugs for, Molly?
50 cents without holes and 60 cents with holes.
Okay. And we also put holes in our lids, and I'm not telling, I know you guys are different beekeepers than I am, so I'm just showing you how we do it. This doesn't mean you need to do it this way. We actually use flat plywood migratory lids. We don't have inner covers or telescoping lids. The reason being that if you load them on a truck, these flat lids work way, way better. And for us, it's a lot cheaper because we don't have an inner cover involved and all of that. Telescoping covers are better on a beehive with an inner cover. That's better for the bees. We're kind of fudging that a little bit and doing what's better for us in this particular instance, and it works fine. I mean, we overwinter lots of bees with these lids. We don't have a problem. So if you want to put a quart jar in a lid, you want a 71 millimeter hole saw to do the job. And jig to hold piece firmly is important? Yeah, it is. because that's a big honking hole saw, and that's a big drill press too. You don't want to do this with a hand drill because you can't hold on to it good enough. This is a big hole, and so you want to put.
it to be going really fast, because if you're going slow, it's going to come out of your hand.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like your law mine with a hand drill.
So we do really well. In fact, Jesse drills a lot of the holes. That piece needs to be held so it won't rattle around on the drill press. It's not hard, just make a jig where it slides in. So if you're worried about putting a bucket on top of a lid with one of these holes and you're worried about rainwater going in, which is a legitimate concern, just use a canning jar ring to put in the hole, and when the rainwater hits the little lip on the canning jar ring, it'll just wander around it and go out the other side. We, in the summer, don't even bother. A little bit of moisture dripping down, the bees take it just fine. I wouldn't want them getting dumped on, but the few drops that find their way down that hole in a rain it seems to be a non-issue for us in the summer. So that's the same lid that you'd find on a standard quart jar. Hellman's Mayonnaise, that's a 70G lid there. And when we're overwintering and not feeding, or anytime we're not feeding, we just put a one-piece lid, metal lid in those holes, and it's like a cork. It's also what we put on our glass jars for feeding smaller colonies or nukes. And we'll just put 1, 2, or 3 two-penny nail holes in that lid. When you get these lids from the catalogs, they got a zillion holes in them, and that's really not necessary unless you're trying to get the syrup in fast. If you want the syrup in fast, then that's a good thing to do. We usually were using these jars to feed a small colony like a nuke that's 2 frames or 5 frames, and one hole is like a little trickle feed. It can take a nuke days and days to get that jar empty with one hole, but it's back to creating this slow and steady intake of sugar syrup. And so if you can actually draw foundation in a 5-frame nuke if you put 3 or 4 two-penny holes in a lid. So you don't need mass quantities of holes to get the job done.
So, Bob, I have a question.
Pardon me?
I have a question.
Sure.
Are you guys about to whack that jar lid with that hammer thingy? That stick
Oh,
with the nail?
yeah, let me back up. Yeah, that's a 2-penny nail put in a stick, and then we put a block of wood over the head of the nail, because otherwise the nail backs out of the stick. That stick is years old. It just keeps on going, just like the Energizer Buddy, as long as you don't break it.
Yeah.
5-pound honey jars are very expensive. They're almost $3 each, but for feeding nukes and stuff, they're your best bet. Quart jar works. Just save your used Hellman mayonnaise jars. You can't get those half-gallon canning jars anymore. You know, the standard 70G lid on a half-gallon canning jar was beautiful. I can't find them anymore. So 5-pound honey jars are expensive, but that's what we use. Yes, sir.
How do you clean your gallon buckets?
Oh, that's something I skipped over. Thank you for asking that. His question, if you couldn't hear it, was how do we clean our buckets if we aren't taking the lid off? And the answer is we splash a little bleach water around in there, a mild bleach solution. Splash it, get the whole inside of the bucket wet with that, let it sit for a while, and then take just a hose nozzle with hot water and put the nozzle inside the hole and blast it all around the bucket. And of course it doesn't get it as clean as if you were in there with a scrub brush scrubbing it, but we found that it's clean enough. It works.
I was always concerned that it was dripping on the brood.
He's concerned about sugar syrup dripping on the brood, and that can be a problem in the sun. Now those 1/16 of an inch holes don't really allow the sugar syrup. Once you turn the bucket, and thank you for asking that question, because I didn't talk about this. You want to fill the bucket or jar or whatever vessel you're using, you want to fill it up, because if you only fill it half full and turn it over, the air in there is elastic, but fluid is not. So if you fill it up, it'll just go a little ways and catch a real tight vacuum and stop dripping. If you fill it up halfway, and especially if you use a larger hole than 1/16, it can drip quite a bit before it stops. But if that bucket is sitting in the sun, first thing in the morning it expands a little bit and there will be some drippage. You don't want to put a 2-gallon bucket with 10 holes on top of a 2 or 3 frame nuke. they could be overwhelmed by the drippage in the morning. But just be mindful of how you're doing this. And that's where the one hole in a jar comes in for us sometimes in the spring. We might just have a frame of brood, a frame of food, and a queen cell, but we got to feed them, and that's where we might use just one hole because they can keep one hole cleaned up as it drips the next morning. They might not keep 4 or 5 holes cleaned up. Does that make sense? So that's just a picture showing one of our nuke mating or queen mating yards full of nukes, and you can see how we just line it up with these 5-pound honey jars. That's in Clayton. Many of you know where this is at, even though you may not have seen it. This yard is directly across from Home Depot in Clayton. You can see the bees, you can see the 48 beehives sitting there, but you can't see the 150 nukes that are back behind their mating queens. Jesse and I were just there today checking nukes that had mated about we put queen cells in them a month ago. And we like to wait 3.5, different subject, we like to wait 3.5 weeks to check anything that had a ripe cell put in it, because if the cell we put in is accepted and it mates and everything works good, you'll begin to see eggs in 2 weeks. But if they rejected our cell, which happens occasionally, not often, but it does happen, they'll raise their own queen, and that takes about 3.5 weeks to see that queen actually was successful. So that's why we like to wait over 3 weeks, but not quite 4. Between 22 to 25 days, that's the period where a queenless colony can get pretty serious about becoming a laying worker. So if you go in around 3.5 weeks, you're right on the verge of that occurring. If you wait 4 or 5 weeks to check on a nuke or whatever it is it's producing a queen, and they were totally unsuccessful, quite often you can see a laying worker situation occurring, which for you newer beekeepers is simply worker bees beginning to lay eggs in desperation because they don't have a queen. Division board feeder, if you look, that's the technical term for them. To us, it's just the inside feeder. We call them inside feeders. We use the Man Lake version, which has, if you look at this closely, it's called cap and ladder. You can purchase these black feeders that are wide open and you can fill them with syrup, but if you don't put something in that feeder for the bees to crawl up and down, you can get a lot of drowned bees in there, and drowned bees turns into a maggot nest for hive beetles. So the bees can't get in the feeder. They can go down the tubes, which is called the ladder, and get down all the way to the bottom and suck the syrup out, but they can't get into the vessel. And it works pretty good as long as the sides aren't sticking out where bees can sneak down between the wood and the plastic, which can happen if you're not careful. And that's them being sold by Man Lake. There are other manufacturers. We just happen to use Man Lake because we're a Man Lake dealer and we get a good price on them. That's just a picture of us filling up these inside feeders. This picture was taken in Unadilla years ago, but it's a fun picture to kind of show how we do it. And we have a pump on our truck, and we have a reel and a 100-foot hose, and we use either 1 or 2 275-gallon totes on the truck. We pull syrup out of those totes, run it through the pump, out the hose, and it works really good. It's just got a nozzle on the end, just like a diesel fuel nozzle, where you're filling diesel fuel into a tractor. You can actually buy them at Tractor Supply, and it works good. So we get asked about additives a lot, and they have their pros and cons. Right now is not a good time to put Honeybee Healthy or anything with lemongrass oil in it, because it is extremely attractive to the bees and it will cause robbing in a heartbeat. They will jump on the truck before you even get out of it sometimes. And they really they tune right into this lemongrass oil. Of course, they say that lemongrass oil is healthy for the bees, helps fight nosema and other things. It curtails the fermentation in thin syrup, which is an issue. Lemongrass oil does that. We actually like the Pro Health version, which is Man Lake's version of Honeybee Healthy, because it has some thymol in it, and thymol is quite an antiseptic. You'll actually see thymol in small portions in things like toothpaste and mouthwash sometimes. It's kind of an antiseptic thing. And We actually, just the opposite of what most people think. We use the additives when there's actually some nectar coming in so the bees are not inclined to rob. Right now we're doing something that's going to sound really strange to y'all. Just bear with me until I explain it completely, because it's going to sound appalling. Right now we're putting bleach in our sugar water to keep it from fermenting. If you make thin syrup, just like thin honey, it will ferment. And if you add one teaspoon of bleach per gallon of sugar syrup, it gives you a little more time. It gives the bees time to take it down before it begins to ferment badly. Now, a little bit of fermentation isn't a bad thing, because just like humans, bees can metabolize a little bit of alcohol. But just like humans, if they get too much, it'll make them sick. And so you got to be careful with that. A little sniff of fermentation, not a huge deal, but if it's really strong, you need to consider getting that bucket clean and starting over again with some fresh stuff. And for us, in a 250 to 275 gallon tote of syrup, that's simply 5 cups of bleach. Now, this is the part where I explain why this is okay. If you go to scientificbeekeeping.com, which is Randy Oliver's site, he's pretty well known, writes an article for American Bee Journal most months, maybe every month. Several years ago, he did a study with putting bleach in syrup to see how it affected the bees, and he used quite a few bees, and he's the one I got this teaspoon per gallon from, and he found that it had no ill effect on the bees, and that in fact the bees did quite fine with it. And he also stated that, and we found this to be true, that if you put this amount of bleach in, it can actually keep your vessel from getting too, I use the word mildew, that's the wrong, what's growing, the stuff that grows in there, it's not mildew, it's algae, that's, yeah, stuff like that. It'll help curtail that growth a little bit. And what he did was he mixed up some sugar syrup, and then 8 hours later, I believe it was 8 hours, don't quote me exactly because I might be a little bit off, but the next day, let's just say the next day, he put chlorine test strips in the sugar syrup, and it showed 0. Chlorine dissipates pretty rapidly. And he was of the opinion, I respect Randy Oliver's opinion because he's pretty good at researching things. He's well known to most beekeepers that are reading the bee journals and stuff like that. And I went with his opinion, and we have found this to be no ill effect, no problem. I know many commercial beekeepers that do exactly that with no problem, so don't be afraid to put a little bit of bleach in your sugar water to keep it from fermenting.
Well, that's the reason they go to swimming pools.
They love chlorine.
You know, and that's the chlorine that's in there.
Yeah, I don't know what's in chlorine that they really like, but they really like it. And they really like saltwater pools
and
too.
that's much stronger than putting a little bit of bleach in.
That's right, yeah. That's right, yeah. Okay, and that, I believe, was the last slide. Is there any questions about all that? I know that's a lot of information, and not everybody's going to get into feeding and look at it as closely as I do, but anyway, is there any questions? Yes, sir.
Do you ever, what's the science behind everything I see, like candy boards and fondant in the winter? How does that relate to what we're talking about?
Well, it's legit. That is, he's talking about candy boards where you have like hard, very thick sugar in the board. Some people use straight sugar, just, over newspaper or something in the colony. That's subsistence feed. That's not going to stimulate anything. That's not going to create any chemistry that we just talked about. But to put that on top of your colony just to get them through winter, it's legit, it works. And it's pure sucrose, so it's there's almost no indigestible elements to that. So up north, that's quite helpful. When some guys overwinter on just candy boards and sugar bricks and things like that and do pretty well. I know a guy in Kentucky, he takes all the honey away. He overwinters in a single, and he puts a big old brick of thick sugar right on top, and he lets the bees feed off of that all winter, and he swears he does really good. And I know him pretty good, and he's a good beekeeper. He's very successful, so I have to give him some credit for what he's doing. Cayman Reynolds in Tennessee, I think his channel is called Tennessee Bees, he talks about that in some of his videos, making sugar bricks and feeding them just sugar in the winter, and it works. I like to get the bees fed up early fall, mid-fall, get them heavy, get them ready for winter, and just leave them alone for the winter if we can. We'll check them when the first pollen starts to come in, which in this area would be the maple trees. That's really the time to check your bees. At that time when that early pollen is coming in, if you have a queen that made it through the winter, she'll be laying eggs, you'll see brood. If you've got no brood during the maple bloom, then you have no queen, or a very bad queen that needs to go to queen heaven, Glad everybody laughed at that. So yeah, there's so many ways of feeding bees. And you know what? Everybody has their different ways, and if it's working for you, and you're having really good success, good overwintering success, and I can't argue with that. This is just us, this is what we do, and it works for us, and I think the theory behind a lot of this chemistry is correct. I've been reading a lot of research articles, and my attitude is, and we don't always do this, but my attitude is if you can do all the little things that you can think of to help be more successful, then maybe something gives you a 2% higher success rate and something else gives you 2 or 5, and you just keep picking on these little things, and suddenly you've gone from losing a third of your bees in the winter to maybe only losing 10%. It's all these little things can add up to success. And feeding your bees is, in my view, more than just 2 or 3%. I think it could be the difference between, done properly, it could be the difference between losing 10% of your bees or 50% of your bees. And by the way, the time for starvation is usually the month of March. So you got to pay attention to the weight in your colonies after they start rearing brood in early spring. That's a little different subject too, but this feed is a big deal. I like to send the colonies into winter very heavy. I often say if they don't feel like a box of rocks, you're not done feeding yet. And of course there is such a thing as too much. You don't want to plug that brood nest so there's no empty cells. That would be a mistake. Although some guys in Canada do just about that. They plug them out so hard, and they put them indoors at about 40 to 45 degrees for the winter for 5 months straight. And they overwinter them on sucrose syrup. You would never pull that off with honey. Never. Well, I should never say never, but the odds are much lower overwintering on honey in a situation. Can you imagine bees that can't go out and defecate for 5 months? Any honey with any indigestible solids would just wreak havoc, so that's what they're doing up there. Manitoba, Ian Stepler, I'm amazed at what he does. If you have a really warm winter, the bees will actually use more food than if it's a moderately cold winter, and he keeps his temperature right in that 45 degree Fahrenheit range, I believe, 40 to 45. I'd have to look at that one of his videos again, but it's not real cold, but it's not warm. You don't want it too warm either. And some winters, what was it? It was last winter we did that video. It was so warm in January. And we had to feed some of our colonies a little bit in January, and got to watch for that too. Back to the art of beekeeping, right, Larry?
Yeah.
You got to be paying attention. You got to learn what your bees are doing. Don't just set the box out in the backyard and hope for the best. That's where you get the 50% of your bees die kind of thing. So I think it's really helpful to become educated. This sounds insulting, and I don't mean it to be, but I like to put beekeepers in 2 categories. Beekeepers, who really work at keeping their bees going and doing the right thing, and bee-havers that don't do anything but just set the box out and hope for the best. And I don't criticize them necessarily, because some people want the bees, but they really don't want to get into that mess of stinging and feeding and all the treating for mites. It's just not their game. And I can't criticize that, but if you want to be successful at beekeeping, you need to be a beekeeper, not a bee-haver. Any more questions before we're done? Yes, ma'am.
Just to clarify, so we really should start feeding now?
It
Because
Personal choice.
It's a personal choice. You don't, okay, first I have to say that I'm not telling you that you have to take all your honey out of the colony and feed them back sugar. That's not what we're talking about. We're in Western North Carolina, not Manitoba, Canada. Your bees can benefit from what we just talked about, but if you have a colony that's full, and I mean full of honey, it could be a mistake to feed right now because you don't want to get them too heavy, too compacted too soon. But if you heft them up and they just don't feel very heavy, it would absolutely be the correct thing to do to start feeding them right now. So that's the art part. Now we're talking about you making a decision and being educated and doing the right thing. So it really comes down to how heavy they are right now. And of course, you should all be treating for mites. You should have already started your mite treatments. The 1st of August is the magic day, and you should have that stuff done here shortly in the next few weeks. And so this is an important time. I actually have a talk. I've never done it here, or maybe I have, I can't remember. It's simply called the Beekeepers calendar year starts on the 1st of August. Yeah. Yeah, it's true. If you want to be successful as you can be, this time right now is one of the very most important times of the year, and it has to do with colony health, meaning get the mites under control, and it has to do with preparing their food stores for winter. And in my view, that all starts right now. Okay, this has been pretty long, almost an hour and a half. Anybody have any last questions before I get out of the way and let Tori take over the meeting again?
Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me.